Look. So, I want to first off thank everyone who helped organize the Comparative Drama Conference this year, especially since it's been a very challenging, I assume, mix of in-person and online. And I want to thank all of you who are attending this conference panel. Thank you for joining us. So my paper is entitled The Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up, Sexuality, Irresponsibility, and Political Economics in Niall, McNeil, and Marcus Youssef's Peter Panties. Peter Pan tells Wendy Darling, "Let's take off our green pants and skirts," before symbolically impregnating her. The pregnancy is played out by inflating a balloon at Wendy's belly until it pops and a baby comes from between Wendy's legs. Peter Pan is now a father. If this scene doesn't sound familiar to you from J.M. Barrie's 1904 play or 1911 novel, don't worry. This scene comes from Niall McNeil and Marcus Youssef's 2011 Peter Panties, an absurdist, postmodern, and deeply intertextual adaptation that draws out issues of Peter's sexuality and the family politics introduced by Barrie's version. Like Barrie's version of Peter, McNeil and Youssef create a narcissistic protagonist who capriciously demands that his own needs and desires be met, though, unlike Barrie's almost asexual Peter, McNeil and Youssef create a sexually obsessive, if immature, version of the boy who refuses to grow up. In my reading, the play also shifts from Barrie's Edwardian industrial capitalist context to a 21st century neoliberal capitalist context, and this shift is deeply tied to Peter's distinct psychology in Peter Panties. I argue that this adaptation of Peter Pan critiques late capitalism's culture of enjoyment and the negative consequences that come with the inability to renounce or delay gratification of desire. Before I get to my main argument, I do want to briefly mention that McNeil has Down syndrome, and that as an artist, writer, and director, he is engaged in disability advocacy. In my larger article about Peter Panties, which will hopefully come out in text and presentation, fingers crossed, I will discuss disability theater and McNeil's work in more detail, though my argument both here and in the larger article primarily addresses the play from a political, economic, psychoanalytic, and sexuality studies perspective. In McNeil and Youssef's play, Peter Pan is sexually aware in a way that he simply isn't in Barrie's versions. But Peter is not yet sexually mature. Mrs. Darling asks Wendy whether Peter has ever had sex before, and Wendy admits that he has not, prompting Mrs. Darling to reflect, "This is the naive side. This is before, something naive. I just realized that. This is new territory. It's unknown." Mrs. Darling recognizes Peter's sexual immaturity, his naivete, which is characteristic of young adults changing from childhood to adulthood, with all the accompanying awkwardness of that transition. And indeed, most of Peter's sexual gestures are childish and selfish, even sexually violent at times. For instance, Peter suggests that he and the Lost Boys can play little sexual games and grope one another, including touching Wendy's breasts. And when Wendy confronts one of the mermaids, Peter tells them to strip to their underwear and have a crotch-kicking show. In other words, Peter's sexual desires are tied in with violence and a narcissistic requirement for his own pleasure, regardless of how it impacts others. Early in the play, sex and violence are explicitly linked when Peter comes to the Darlings' home and talks with Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Darling says, "I keep seeing aggression, and I keep seeing sex." Peter says, "Yeah, there's sex." Mrs. Darling says, "Yeah, and there's aggression." Peter says, "And kissing, fighting, people falling in love. What do you think about that, Mrs. Darling? That I want to have kids, sex-wise. You're the mother." Although Peter claims to be 28, his sexual identity is stunted, linked to aggression, and tied up with a desire to please the mother figure, who in this case is Mrs. Darling. These specific elements of sexual immaturity are characteristic of what psychoanalyst Dan Kiley termed Peter Pan syndrome, or PPS, which is characterized by an adult man's childish inability to develop a full adult identity. PPS is generally characterized by irresponsibility, anxiety, mood swings, narcissism, and a compromised sexual identity. The most prominent characteristics of the PPS sufferer's sexuality are chauvinism that often manifests by demanding that a partner conform to the man's ideal, sexual exploitation or violence, and treating a romantic partner as a substitute mother from whom the PPS victim can get love and approval. In Barrie's play and novel, Peter seeks a mother, a role taken on primarily by Wendy, whereas Wendy tries to develop a romantic relationship with Peter. This is a central theme. And McNeil and Youssef downplay the longing for a mother figure, although at the end of the play Peter does reflect, "I don't have a mother," and the rehabilitated Hook replies, "Okay, fine, I'll share my mother with you." Perhaps, though, it's more accurate to say that McNeil and Youssef transform the theme of motherhood by making Wendy actually bear Peter a child. Peter and Wendy's child exposes another aspect of PPS, namely Peter's irresponsibility and narcissism. He repeatedly expresses the desire to have a child with Wendy. But once the child is born, according to the stage directions, Peter leaves. After Peter leaves her with the baby, Wendy says, "I don't want to have any more kids." This is essentially the last we see of the baby. And this is significant because Peter has now gratified his desire for a child but shows no interest in the responsibilities of fatherhood, even having Niall McNeil himself come on stage at the end of the play to marry Wendy, presumably also as a substitute father to the baby, although this is never explicitly brought up. The pattern demonstrated by Peter here, fulfilling his desires without willingness to accept accountability for his actions, is the governing logic of late capitalist consumption. In his book The End of Dissatisfaction, Todd McGowan argues that the nomos of late capitalism is desire, and that desire drives capitalist production and reshapes the human psyche. As he puts it, rather than demanding that its members give up their individual enjoyment for the sake of the whole, the society of enjoyment commands their enjoyment. Private enjoyment becomes of paramount importance. Individual gratification is tied to the capitalist mode of production growth because the demands of enjoyment are played out as demands for consumption, with a corresponding demand for continual production. McGowan explains, global capitalism functions by submitting all cultural life to the process of commodification, and this process can only be sustained if everyone is engaged in the endless pursuit of enjoyment. Similarly, Samo Tomšič writes, the unconscious production of jouissance and the social production of value follow the same logic and display the same structural contradictions, tensions, and deadlocks. Not repression of productive potentials of sexuality, drives, and desires, but the insatiable demand for production. In other words, both capitalism and the psychology of late capitalism of the late capitalist subject function under the same demand for continual expansion. There can never be enough goods produced, enough profit, or enough enjoyment. However, living under the governing logic of enjoyment rather than the industrial capitalist logic of renunciation has reshaped the psychology of the modern subject into what McGowan terms pathological narcissism. The pathological narcissist has a psychological need not only for success, but for that success to be socially acknowledged. It's not sufficient to have financial or romantic accomplishments, but the other must acknowledge the pathological narcissist's accomplishments. This is related to what Oliver James calls affluenza, which he characterizes as placing a high value on acquiring money and possessions, looking good in the eyes of others, and wanting to be famous. Both affluenza and pathological narcissism are tied to an ownership mentality where gratification of desires is viewed almost exclusively as a matter of consuming objects, including other people who are treated as objects. Affluenza and pathological narcissism are also linked to wealth, as conspicuous consumption requires a degree of financial stability and freedom. Similarly, Kylie links Peter Pan syndrome to middle or upper class social status because money allows the individual the freedom not to worry about problems like food or shelter, and to focus on building an identity through the consumption of products. PPS is therefore a fellow traveler with conditions like affluenza and pathological narcissism, psychological problems in which the victim is driven primarily by a need to gratify their own desires and gain the approval of others. Now, at this point, you may reasonably object that these connections are largely outside McNeil and Youssef's play, and that Peter abandoning Wendy and her baby is not sufficient grounds for arguing that Peter Panties provides a commentary on late capitalism. However, the critique of capitalism comes to the fore when we contrast Peter's pursuit of enjoyment with Mr. Darling's Edwardian-style renunciation of enjoyment. In Chapter 9, shortly after the birth of her baby, Wendy arrives at the bank where Mr. Darling works. Wendy tries to interact with her father on an interpersonal level, at one point telling him, "I don't want you to be upset, Dad." To which he responds with a professional and detached, "How much money do you want to take out?" The banker, Mr. Darling, turns away the familial connection, instead embracing fully his professional role. The renunciation of the personal is even more apparent when Wendy asks if she can hug him, and Mr. Darling replies, "This is a public place." The refusal of the hug, a symbol of interpersonal intimacy, because they are in a public and professional space, signifies Mr. Darling's renunciation of enjoyment, aligning him with the tradition of industrial capitalism, which required subjects to sacrifice their enjoyment for the good of society/the economy. This attitude is a stark contrast to Peter's childish desire to enjoy without the apparent willingness to take responsibility for the results of his enjoyment, i.e. Wendy's baby. Peter also wants to continue enjoying even when that enjoyment becomes socially inappropriate, as when he continues flirting with Wendy even as she's marrying McNeil at the end of the play. In Peter Panties, Peter Pan is a poster child for the late capitalist culture of enjoyment with its psychological demand for pleasure without accountability. He's sexually exploitative of Wendy and the mermaids, who at one point striptease in silhouette in a tent, and he repeatedly states that he wants to have a baby with Wendy, but then shows no interest in raising the child or even being present. Peter's sexuality, for all that it's more overt than in Barrie's play or novel, is still adolescent. This is demonstrated in a conversation with Mrs. Darling. Peter says, "I want to have sex and have kids." Mrs. Darling says, "Having sex is growing up, isn't it?" Peter says, "So?" Mrs. Darling says, "That's not what a child wants." Like a child trying to gratify a desire, Peter's sexuality remains entirely about his own enjoyment. His attitude is childish even as he enters the ostensibly adult world of sexuality. We may therefore think of Peter as the boy who refuses to grow up, not in the sense of not experiencing or desiring sexual pleasure, but in the sense of rejecting any responsibility to others. Peter refuses to grow into a responsible adult even as he enters sexual maturity. For him, Wendy exists as an object to fulfill his sexual impulses, not as a subject in her own right to whom he might have responsibilities. In this sense, McNeil and Youssef's Peter Pan reflects both the childishness of Peter Pan syndrome and the pathological narcissism of the late capitalist society of enjoyment. Thank you.